How amazing it is that anything exists at all. How amazing it is that we humans have evolved brains that have symbolic language that can come up with words like exist with which to anchor a sentence that can capture that sense of awe that we have, that we may also even, scientists now say, share with animals, that anything exists at all. Hi, my name is Bill, and I'll be your moderator for the evening. And tonight we're going to explore the dance between language and science, the dance between science and religion, the dance between faith and science and religion, which is actually an ancient dance. Science and faith have always been the closest of dance partners down through the century, dancing with the original real stars for starters, sometimes bickering with each other as they dance, but more often teaching each other new dance steps, lending each other insights as fast as you can say transubstantiation, which is a word that delights priests and quantum physicists alike. Our language is always overlapping between these two fields. There's an explosion right now in the scientific study of animal intelligence that is finding that they too may share all of the traits possibly that we humans only 50 or 100 years ago thought were unique to us, including religious ideas, ideas of consciousness and reason and empathy and thinking about thinking, as if all these mental states we once thought suddenly just appeared creationist-like only in our brains. Maybe us and the Neanderthals, as we now know from the science last week. We are all part Neanderthal in this room. Did the Neanderthals have religion? Did they have science? Do elephants have religion or science? Or parrots? Or dogs? Surely dogs do. These are serious questions that are now being explored by scientists and theologians, often together. For example, the fMRI imaging being used by Buddhist monks and neurologists together in labs to see, for seeing is believing, there's a word, how nirvana might look, at least as it's expressed itself in brain cells, human and possibly those of other animals. How scientists can now get inside the heads of animals isn't the half of it. Scientists, like the great evolutionary biologist Elaine Pagels, is now asking us to think about how animals get inside the brains of us humans, or rather literally are the brains of us humans, as she reasons that brain cells are the evolutionary descendants of single-celled microbes, just harnessed in concert of mutual communication, trapped inside our cells to do the bidding as they communicate with each other of the large creatures that are walking them around. Religion and science is all over that conversation, and it's accelerating apace. Each brain cell coming from what was formerly a bacterium, just frustrated now that it's pinned down and can't squiggle, and so it signals to the other trapped bacteria inside of our brains, the other brain cells, to generate thoughts like how amazing it is that anything exists at all. Bacteria talk. Just one of the examples of the many these days that show how easy it is to discuss what we've often thought of as religious questions in terms of also scientific terms. The terms are overlapping, as we shall see this evening. But first, two quick semantic points before we bring out our remarkable panel. One regarding the words faith and believe. For both theologians and scientists constantly use the words faith and believe all the time. We now believe, the scientists now believe that the earth is not flat. We now believe that the earth goes around the sun on pretty good evidence. Evidence is never absolute, as scientists remind us. In fact, faith, according to the modern philosophy of science, is what science and religion have in common. The modern philosophy of science says that the best science ever does is come up with hypotheses, which are the best picture that scientists can give us so far about what the situation really is out there. There's no such thing as absolute proof or absolute truth, scientists constantly remind us layfolk, in science. We can never be sure that we've understood the whole picture as we keep discovering. Secondly, a semantic point about the word religion. It may be limited, as great scholars like Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who studied world religions, pointed out to us. Rather, he says what's really out there is not just religion, but belief systems of many kinds and faith systems. Sounds an awful lot like science, with its belief systems and its faith traditions that keep growing and changing in paradigm shifts. In fact, those who believe in evolution, evolutionary biologists, are these days having fascinating conversations with theologians because the evolutionary biologists are putting new light on ideas like sin, which is an over-impulse to merely survive physically, and altruism, which religion has always extolled, something that Edward O. Wilson and other great biologists are now telling us is something natural within your group. And these days, our group is increasingly the entire human race. Religion and science getting it on. They've long been two sides of the same spinning coin in a certain sense. Fides et ratio, faith and reason, one of the most important writings of John Paul II, who believed that faith and reason need each other. As good old Einstein said, quoted as we all know, science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. And to quote New York Rabbi Michal Springer, who points out that the rabbis have always taught that certainty begets fanaticism. This is an ancient teaching of scientists and religious people alike. Certainty begetting fanaticism is a warning that wise old scientists have for years been giving young scientists in the labs around the world. Well, our four remarkable panelists this evening are way out ahead of me and other layfolk in these warm-up thoughts that I've just presented to get a few concepts going. These are professionals distinguished from four different parts of the world in all of this science, faith, religion, exploration dance. And they're going to give us a glimpse this evening of some of their latest steps as science, faith, and religion all talk to each other. So let's meet them one by one. First of all, I would like to introduce Mr. Thupten Jinpa, who is translator and editor for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He's long been part of the discussions that the Dalai Lama has had with scientists. He's a distinguished scholar and a former Buddhist monk for more than 20 years. He holds degrees in Western philosophy and religious studies and is also currently affiliated with the Stanford Center of Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, which is researching the neural underpinnings of thoughts and emotions. Mr. Jinpa. Elaine Pagels, people often ask how you pronounce it. Is it a hard or soft G? It's Pagels. Her husband, Heinz Pagels, a theoretical physicist, often said Pagels rhymes with bagels. Elaine is the Harrington Spear Payne Professor of Religion at Princeton University and a MacArthur Fellow. She's winner of both the National Book Critics Award and a National Book Award. She's best known for her work on the early Christian texts of Gnostic Gospels, and her book, The Gnostic Gospels, was chosen by the Modern Library as one of the 100 best books of the 20th century. She's at work on a book about Revelation right now. Elaine Pagels. Mr. Paul Davies, by profession a theoretical physicist and a cosmologist, but these days he also works in the field of astrobiology, a new field of research that seeks both to understand the origin and evolution of life and to search for life beyond Earth. In 2008, he established the Arizona State University Beyond Center for Fundamental Concepts and was also appointed co-director of the ASU Cosmology Initiative. He's also working in cancer research. In 1995, he was awarded the Templeton Prize. Mr. Paul Davies. And Mr. Francisco Ayala, who holds professorships in biology, in philosophy, in logic, and philosophy of biology, a field that he helped to establish, at the University of California in Irvine. He was also ordained a Dominican priest, but he never practiced as a priest. He came to America to earn a doctorate in genetics and evolution from Columbia University. He's authored more than 40 books and 1,000 papers and has been one of the world's leading pioneers in evolutionary genetics and molecular biology. And he's this year's winner of the Templeton Prize, an award which honors a living person who's made an exceptional contribution to affirming life's spiritual dimensions, whether through insight, discovery, or practical work. He lives now in California. Please welcome our panel. Have a seat. Now, we've asked each of our panelists to pick a piece of music and an image which best describes their thoughts about the interplay between faith and science. So first to present them, and you'll see the words, by the way, on the screen of each of these folks, are those images and words and music picked by Mr. Francisco Ayala. So what I'm going to do now is speak with each of our panelists and bring them out about 10 minutes each with each of their videos, and then we're going to have a general discussion. And at the end, we'll have time for a couple of questions as well. Mr. Ayala, first, a question I'm going to ask each panelist to start with, before we talk about the images you chose. What is your position on religion? How do you feel about it? Are you religious?
Well, whether I'm religious or not in my personal life is very important for me and my family and close friends. I'm very much engaged in the dialogue or conflict, if you wish, between some extreme religious groups which are denying evolution, and on the other hand, some evolutionists and scientists who are denying religion. And I think it is very important for me, for my public image, not to declare what my convictions are, because the moment I declare my convictions, one or the other side is going to say, well, that's why Francisco Ayala takes this position, because he's religious or because he's not religious. And I think the ideas that I present are independent of what my convictions are. So I am not prepared to declare in public what my religious convictions are.
And when people say, do you believe in God, yes or no? How do you handle that?
I think it's part of the same answer, so I can repeat the answer, which will be a little bit tiresome.
Right. All right, well, let's get down to finding out what the exploration of these ideas are. Why did you choose Guernica, as you've said is the right pronunciation?
Well, it was actually suggested by one of the organizers because I use it in one of my books as a metaphor for the relationship and the difference between religion and science. On April 27, 1937, early in the Spanish Civil War, Nazi airplanes under the command of General Franco bombed the city of Guernica. It was not a military target of any kind. A city of 7,000 people is thought by the Basques the spiritual home of the Basques. The Basques had rebelled against the coup d'etat of Franco, so the Nazi airplanes bombed the city. They killed 25% of the population, 1,750 people out of the 7,000 population. Pablo Picasso, the great Spanish painter, had been commissioned by the Republican government to paint a mural for the Spanish pavilion for the world exhibit that was going to take place in Paris in October. Picasso, hearing of this massacre, in a rage and in a fit of manic energy, sketched in 12 days this painting, which is an enormous painting. It's about close to 24 feet long by close to 9 feet tall. Well, suppose now for a moment that I were going to describe the painting to you and tell you the material used as the canvas, the dimensions, the pigments used, and even give you the physical coordinates of every stroke, every brush stroke in the painting. And at the end of that, I would say I have told you what Guernica is all about. And most people would say, but you have not told us anything about what interests us about Guernica, which is the meaning and purpose. So I see science and religion as two windows through which we can look at the world. What we see is different, is the same world. But science deals with the composition of matter, the expansion of the galaxies, the origin and diversity of organisms. Religion deals with the purpose and meaning of life, with the relationship, our relationship to the Creator and to each other, and with the moral values that govern our lives. These are different ways of looking at the world, as in the case of Guernica, the physical description is very interesting and important. When science has had its say, though, there is a lot about life that remains to be known, for which we don't learn from science. And as I said a moment ago, there are the questions that interest most humans most of the time. What is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of life?
So two different windows, as you see it, science and religion. But You are yourself a geneticist. There was another famous religious person, a monk, who was famous for being a founder of genetics, Mendel. How did religion increase or inspire, if it did, your interest in science?
Well, that's a very interesting question because I went through a phase where I graduated in physics at the University of Madrid, and it was at the time when I became interested in religion, and then I studied theology for 5 years, and I was ordained a priest, as you pointed out. During the last 2 years of my studies of theology, I became very interested in the origin of humans and the evolution of humans and trying to understand that. And it's how I decided to change careers, which I did with the approval of my superiors, which very much endorsed the idea that I would come to the United States as a student to learn about genetics and evolution. So I cannot say there was a causal relationship between science going to theology and theology going back to science. They were simply part of my personal evolution.
Two different windows, as you say. One other point you mentioned, you feel strongly about creationism not being taught in schools and modern biology being taught in schools?
Well, creationism is so-called creationism is not science and should not be taught in school the same way that we don't teach alchemy or witchcraft. That's just not science. And if one wants to express ideas of creationism and deal with them in history or social science classes, that's fine, but it is not science, and therefore it should not be taught in science, a scientific subject.
Do you feel that science offers hope in the same way religion does? Last year, after this faith and science meeting, one woman afterwards said, you know, the thing about religion is about comfort, she said. It shouldn't really be a conflict. Do you feel that science offers hope in the same way that religion does, or is it something for you very different?
I would not say so. I think science is very satisfactory. Understanding the world, in my case, understanding the origin and diversity of organisms, understanding, for example, the causation and evolution of diseases like malaria, that gives me a lot of personal satisfaction. You want to call that hope, fine, but I don't think it's hope in the sense of we understand hope when we express it as a religious value.
But just to repeat one thing you said at the beginning, to you and your family, perhaps, religion is important, but you don't want to go into the details.
Well, what my religious convictions are is very important for my family. But I don't want to go into the details in public. That's correct.
There we have our first position on the issue. Thank you very much, Francisco.
Thank you.
And now, Mr. Paul Davies. I don't want to say it's a position. It's a very interesting introduction. Mr. Paul Davies has chosen some images and thoughts. He's a physicist who has challenged the thoughts of many people about science and faith. He's difficult to pigeonhole. His object and images of choice are very much Paul Davies. Here they are. Let's take a look. So, Paul, before I ask you about why you chose that, the question for everybody, do you believe in God, yes or no?
I believe in a meaningful scheme of things, and I don't believe in miracles. And I agree with Francisco on this.
And are you religious?
I think to be religious, you've got to belong to a religious organization, and I don't. If you'd have asked me, am I a spiritual person, then I would undoubtedly say yes.
All right. Well, let's ask, why did you choose Dirac's equation for the spin of an electron as implanted in the floor of Westminster Abbey, and that music?
Well, I was born a theoretical physicist, so it's really important to understand where I'm coming from. And so I divide people into physicists and the rest, and the physicists here will know why I picked the Dirac equation, because it's often said that Einstein's general theory of relativity is the pinnacle of human intellectual achievement. And in some ways that may be correct, one could argue about it. But the Dirac equation, with its simplicity and its power and its elegance above all, I think to most physicists embodies the finest tradition of what we're attempting to achieve. If I could just take a moment, people use the word theory in all sorts of different ways. To a physicist, theory means a very particular set of ideas. It really means using mathematics to decode the hidden subtext of nature. When we look around us, we see a bewildering array of natural phenomena. We don't see equations. You have to dig to a deeper level to extract those equations. And so the mathematics that underpins the phenomena of nature is like this hidden subtext. And the job of the theoretical physicist is to uncover that mathematical order that exists in nature, write it down in terms of mathematical equations, and then go on an intellectual voyage of discovery by manipulating those equations, solving them, going on to make predictions. There's no other science that does this. There is no theoretical biology, I'm sure Francisco will agree, in quite the same sense. There's no even really theoretical chemistry. It's what physicists will call phenomenology. And so the point I'm trying to make is that this is a window on the world that seems to be at this particular time unique to physics. And so by uncovering this hidden mathematical order in nature, we glimpse something about reality which can't be obtained in any other way.
About reality, is it a theory that there is a mathematical order to nature?
Well, it's an act, I often say it's an act of faith, and my colleagues jump on me. They say, well, it's not, faith. But I'm using it in the sense of being faithful. I think you cannot be a physicist without being faithful to the idea that there is a law-like order in nature.
But as Popper would say, it's a hypothesis, a theory that there is an order.
We can relax that a little bit, but I think you just wouldn't go about practicing physics if you didn't sort of deep in yourself really believe that it is the case, that there is a law-like order in nature. It would be a rather pointless exercise. And let me give you a classic example, the Large Hadron Collider. We've heard a lot about that. When this was being built, it wasn't on the assumption, well, we'll build this thing and we'll collide these particles together, and it may be total meaningless nonsense that we will get out of it. There is this faith or belief or assumption that the deeper we dig into nature, the more law-like order we will expose. So there is this organization of things that will be dug out.
Does this picture of order that you get, does it give you a sense of meaning, a sense of security to believe? So the psychologists will say that we need a meaning system or we scatter, and this gets very biologist here at this point. They say to survive, we are creatures who have evolved this habit to see order so that we can keep our act together.
You see, I think that's a load of bunkum. You see, people will often say that we're just reading the order into nature, we're not reading it out of nature, that it's convenient to organize our thoughts and our observations around these equations and so on. I just think that's not true. It is simply the case that, for example, there is an inverse square law of gravitation, which means that the gravitational force that a planet feels twice as far from the sun is 1/4. It's simply a fact about the world. And I don't think this is a sociological phenomenon. I think it's simply true that there is a law-like order in nature, and that in being a physicist, your job is to uncover that law-like, a really existing law-like order. We don't project it onto nature, we read it out of nature.
Well, since physics works in our brains and we evolve with the brains that we have.
Now, I heard this argument.
Well, I'm not trying to make an argument, I'm trying to ask a question. Is there a natural history that physicists may help us understand, a natural history of religion?
Oh, that's a different question.
Yes.
And that's, and I thought you were going to say something else, and we would have been here a long time.
I'm just a journalist.
No, I think it's really fascinating to look back at the way human beings have evolved, and it's clear that religion is has been a very important part of everybody's life, going back into the mists of time. When we look back at the early societies, well, of course, this is a hypothesis, but my own feeling is that the emergence of what we would call religion or spirituality, certainly religious practices, and the emergence of culture generally, of mathematics and music and language and all of these things, really all came together as part of the evolution of the modern human mind, which goes back tens of thousands of years. This is
and you would say, as a physicist, has principles that come from physics.
Well, this touches on a difficult and contentious subject as to what one might mean by laws of nature. Now, physicists tend to think of laws in a rather reductionistic way, and I showed the Dirac equation, which exemplifies the sort of bottom level of reality. And then physicists divide into two. There are those that think that's all there is, that they're just the laws at the bottom. There's no room further up for any other laws. And then there's another group of physicists who believe in emergence, that is, that as systems become more and more complex, there can be levels of description and emergent behavior which require their own laws, which are consistent with but not reducible to the laws at the bottom level. And then if you're an out-and-out emergentist, you would say that these emergent laws of complexity, say, are just as fundamental as the underlying laws like the Dirac equation. And so therefore one could believe that as you go step by step up in this hierarchy of complexity through the emergence of life, the emergence of consciousness, the emergence of social organization and so on, that there is law-like activity or law-like phenomena which emerges at that level. And when we get into areas like ethics, right and wrong and so on, then this is one view that one could take, that these are law-like principles which are meaningless at the level of atoms, but which are completely meaningful at the level of human organization, say.
Which is very much about, among other things, physical survival and carrying on. As it says in the book of Genesis, God saw that it was good. Well, speaking of God, does this physics base that you've just described to us have anything to say about why anything exists at all?
Probably not, no. No.
That's an open question for you.
Well, why something exists or why anything exists is really not a scientific problem. And so there's a glib answer, which is, of course, there's only one way for nothing to exist, but there's an infinite way in which something might exist, infinite number of ways. So therefore it's much more likely that something exists.
So we evolved creatures who come up with this question. We don't get it from
We do. And the book before last that I wrote was very much about whether we can ever get a closed and complete explanation of existence.
And I'm taking notes.
Well, we'll be here a long time again. It's the problem of the Tower of Turtles. The way these things are normally phrased is that we try to explain the world in terms of deeper laws and principles and so on, and then we ask where do they come from, and you go on down and down and down this Tower of Turtles. And the question is there a levitating super turtle holding this entire stack up? And what is the nature of that super turtle? Or is this whole line of linear reasoning really not the way forward? And I think I probably ended up talking myself into the latter, that we're framing words and concepts and questions like the one you just framed because our brains have evolved to see and understand the world in a certain way. And so we talk in terms of cause and effect and linear chains of causation and so on because that was the way our brains have evolved to cope with surviving in the proverbial jungle. But when we're into this ultimate meaning of existence, the universe as a whole and so on, I just think maybe these concepts are not the appropriate ones ones to frame the question.
Interesting. I think you just gave it the answer to the famous story, as it's often told, when the boy asks the wise old man who's told him that the world is on the back of a turtle, it's on the back of another turtle. He asks, what's that turtle on? And the answer is, it's turtles all the way down.
Right, you see. So we don't want turtles all the way down. But then if we want to terminate with a levitating super turtle, we're into all the problems about, what is that entity? And of course, it's interesting that in the Christian tradition, you must have learned this stuff when you became a priest, the notion that of a necessary being holding this up. And
a necessary being.
A necessary being is a being whose non-existence is a logical impossibility. If you had a necessary being, if a necessary being could exist, you might have the basis for a levitating super turtle. And Christian theologians flirted with the idea over centuries of the existence of a necessary being. I think they're largely given up on it these days. Is that right? I defer to my theologically more sophisticated colleagues.
So, no.
Some people still...
Some people maintain what is called the St. Anselm's argument for the existence of God.
Right. So, of course, it's not clear that the necessary being that might emerge from the foundations of logic has got anything to do with any sort of God anyone has been thinking about.
This is producing in me a great sense of awe. And I noticed that Elaine Pagels' eyes have been getting brighter and brighter as both of you have been talking.
Tell us about necessary being.
Elaine Pagels. So Elaine Pagels has delved into the mystery of the Bible, and this evening is, I doubt, going to be any exception. She's provided us with her image and music, but she didn't provide any text. So we will leave it to Elaine to reveal to us, after we have seen her image and the music that she chose, why she did. Let's take a look. Elaine, before we ask about that image and that music,
Yes.
Are you religious? How do you feel about it? Do you believe in God? Do you practice a faith?
These are the kinds of questions that my work makes me think about, and I very much appreciate the difficulty that people have had with them. I was brought up to think that religion was obsolete. In my family, my father was a biologist who had given up religion for Darwin, and thought of religion and science as conflicting conceptual structures. I mean, religion is a kind of poor person's science. If they're just not smart enough or educated enough to have science, then they have to make do with something inferior, which was an archaic system which is now fortunately out of date.
Do you still feel that way?
Of course not. I mean, I discovered that I was incorrigibly religious in the sense that I love the music, and I think it's brilliant to start with the images, the music, because that is what articulates what fascinated me about a whole different dimension of reality. And I was lucky to be married to Heinz Pagels, who's a physicist, who saw it much more as the scientists we've just talked with have, that there wasn't a conflict between these, that there are very different modes of perception.
Different modes of perception.
Yes.
Have any events in your own life changed and evolved? Was there a period during which you were practicing religious and then moved beyond it? Or?
Oh, well, it's not a question of practicing or non-practicing. I engage it very much, but I think one can engage the same dimensions that we call religious. I mean, look at the painting or
Yes.
the music. You don't have to have something explicitly religious to engage those dimensions of reality that religious tradition has. But what fascinates me is how religion is still so powerful and important, and why it hasn't died out the way I was told it would. It hasn't, and I think it won't, because it's part of the way our brains function, and absolutely essential to the way we perceive.
You have brought to the world a wonderful new awareness of the Gnostics, with a silent G at the beginning. These astonishing thinkers who those of us who were lucky enough to go to college still can't quite figure out, but you have. What did the Gnostics teach us about the relationship between science and religion? How have they,
Well,
why did you go there?
that's a different thing. But when I was in graduate school, suddenly there had been discovered a whole find of over 50 ancient Christian texts that we simply didn't know about. So I don't work on Gnosticism, I work on the history of Christianity. And now we have a much wider range of the history of Christianity to really understand a lot more historically about how this tradition emerged. But I'm working on the book of Revelation now because, well, this is a book that intellectuals tend to really hate. And because it's only visions. It's only about dreams and visions like Behemoth and Leviathan. And I'm thinking there's something preconceptual and much more essential as part of our dream structure, part of the way we imagine the universe, the way we imagine ourselves.
Is there a natural history to religion, are you finding, as you look
Oh,
at
I
it?
think there is. I mean, that could articulate part of it. But some of what
Why William Blake? Why that
some of
picture?
what's involved here could not be articulated. I would love a scientific and neurological, more neurological study of religion and the way it affects people, or say religious music. I was talking with a neurobiologist in California about music and how it affects the brain. And he said he was going to give this music to a Jewish, a Christian, and a Muslim graduate student. And I immediately said, there won't be any difference in the way they respond. He said, I know. Because it's not about conceptual
You
structures.
mean the way they respond neurologically?
Right.
No
so
difference.
It's deeper than that, I think, and it's prior to that
What's
conceptual
the it?
structure.
What's deeper than that?
Well, I think the response to certain intuitions about meaning. Now, those two choices, some of you know that Olivier Messiaen was a French musician. He was in the French army in 1940, captured by the Germans, and he was in a German prison camp, and wrote about later about how he looked out of this horrifying camp with the violence and incomprehensibility of that war, looked out and saw a rainbow, and he connected it with the rainbow in the book of Revelation, with the angel standing with a face blazing like the sun, with a rainbow over his head, with 1 foot on the ocean and 1 foot in the sky, and the angel says, there shall be no more time. And Messiaen wrote this brilliant piece of music, listening to the birds, you could hear the birds, talking about how time stopped. And that piece, as you may know, was played in the German prison camp by prisoners, played for prisoners in 1941 on a freezing January night. It's about a spiritual dimension that Messiaen intuited in that horrendous situation.
This spirituality emerging in the worst traumas, in the midst of the worst traumas.
Well, that's where one needs it most.
In fact, many of the great religions have come through periods of or realizations about horrible traumas and suffering, and we're getting closer to the Buddhist at the end of the line here. But
may I say, well, Judaism comes out of a history of slavery, and the whole Passover, of course, is about that. The Christian movement comes out of Judaism, out of the violence of a brutal and unjust execution, and people trying to find significance in it, so that even when Viktor Frankl, who was a secular Jewish psychiatrist in Auschwitz, wanted to write about meaning in those kinds of deaths that he was seeing all around him, he talked about countless crucifixions, just as Marc Chagall did.
meaning, a very important word for this discussion. We're finding perhaps different sources of what are the basis of solid meaning. Even if it's only a super levitating turtle, it'll be solid at least enough for us to, what, feel good? Why do we want meaning? Why does it matter?
But it may not be conceptual. It may not be something you can put in language. That's perhaps why I didn't use language here.
That we cannot put in language.
Well, some things can, but this language in which you articulate this kind of dimension of experience is not literal. It doesn't have to be taken literally to be taken seriously.
And what you've just touched on there is one of the reasons that more and more scientists are now talking about intelligence and consciousness in animals who don't use verbal language.
Right.
To complete our panel here, the images from Mr. Thupten Jinpa. He is Tibetan, and he has spent many years in a Buddhist monastery in India, and for 5 years he taught Buddhist epistemology and physics, and middle way philosophy and Buddhist psychology. His chosen music is entitled Spiegel im Spiegel by Arvo Pärt, and it's a phrase, Spiegel im Spiegel, which can literally mean both mirror in the mirror or mirrors in the mirror, which I will ask you to explain after we listen and look. I'm sighing. It's very relaxing. I have to ask the question, as I have the other panelists. Are you religious? Do you believe in God?
Actually, the word religious is a problematic one in the context of my own faith, which is Buddhism. Because the Tibetan word that we use that is often kind of used in place of religion is Chö, which literally means transformation. So idea of a kind of a spiritual transformation, moving from an imperfect state to a more perfect and enlightened state. So in that sense, yes, I am a religious practitioner. I have a daily practice. I'm a Buddhist.
And when you're asked about God, do you believe in God?
That's a more problematic question. I mean, someone who has been brought up in the Buddhist tradition, God in the sense of a necessary being that Paul Davies was referring to, is not part of our heritage. In Buddhist tradition, there is no notion of creation or a creator that stands outside the network of causes and effects.
Let's just repeat that for the Westerners here. You have no notion of a creator or of creation outside
Well, creator in the sense of a transcendent being that stands outside the cause and effect nexus, a kind of a necessary being that sets in motion. That notion is not there.
How does Buddhism intersect with science as we think of science?
Well, I mean, if you look at the history of the development of Buddhist thought in India, classical India, the kind of separation that you notice in the Western context between science, philosophy, and religion has never really occurred. So when you look at a tradition like Buddhism, it's very problematic to classify as being one of the religious traditions, and its engagement with science is somehow an engagement between religion and science in the Western sense. Because in Buddhism, you have certain aspects of the tradition which are very scientific, where empirical evidence is the most important component of a mode of inquiry. You also have aspects of the tradition which are clearly religious in the sense of pertaining more to ultimate questions of our existence, meaning, purpose, and so on. And then there are aspects of the tradition which are very philosophical, where kind of argumentation and reasoning is the primary mode of inquiry. So it's difficult to say that engagement between Buddhism and science in the modern sense is an engagement between religion and science, because Buddhism is in a sense a complete worldview which contains scientific elements, philosophical elements, and religious elements.
And that's why you sometimes get answers when Westerners ask people with Eastern religions, we just found this out, and you get the answer, we already knew that. Sometimes.
Yes.
Or so it seems. The Dalai Lama is very interested in science, and especially in neurology. Like we've been hearing about Buddhists related with the Dalai Lama
Sure.
being in neurology labs
Sure.
with things attached to their heads, trying to
Sure.
see what a state of nirvana looks like in the brain. Tell us about this.
Well, actually, there is a sort of to some extent, an opportunistic element in the motivation of Buddhist, thinkers like the Dalai Lama engaging with science, because history of Buddhism has always, had development of the Buddhist ideas in relation to its engagement with other non-Buddhist traditions in India. So classical India was a very intellectually rich place where Buddhist and non-Buddhist, like the Vedantic schools and Nyayikas, others were all kind of interacting with each other. So what is happening now for the Buddhist is, in some sense, the continuation of the same story. Now the kind of the partner in the dialogue is science, because the scientific worldview is one of the most influential and dominant worldview. And since Buddhism prizes empiricism very highly, and empirical evidence and reason triumphs scriptural authority, so in many aspects of our understanding of reality, in a sense, what the Buddhist tradition is doing is filling the blanks, as it were, by getting the facts from science, where we can. So it may be in astronomy or physics, or it may be in neuroscience, where the advantage of modern science is, with its very sophisticated technology today, you can actually peer into someone's brain and see patterns, associated with certain aspects of human thinking, thoughts, and emotions, which for the Buddhists, the only mode of inquiry is, primarily kind of first-person experience through meditation and phenomenological.
That's the only moral inquiry.
A mode of inquiry.
Oh, the only mode of inquiry
is
meditation, first-person
meditation and philosophy.
And so what you're saying in general is that the Buddhist tradition down through the centuries has had no problem with whatever the empirical science of the day was. It is kept enfolding them.
In principle, yes.
In principle.
In theory.
In theory. Interesting distinction. Of course, at the other end of the panel, a representative who grew up within the Roman Catholic Church, which has, in some parts of its history, had a bit of a division with apparently empirical science, like Galileo. If we take the popular version of that story. But you're beginning to talk here about something that we're seeing more and more of these days. You talk about the worldview or the story which each religion tells, and we're hearing people from a number of different religions these days say, we're also getting a universal global story being told by science that each religion is finding ways to accommodate with. And you're saying that Buddhism is not having much trouble accommodating there at all. It's having fun, because I hear there's a great deal of fun going on between these monks and these scientists. What are they seeing in there?
Well, what you see is basically a pattern on the screen. And this is where I think the participation of Buddhists and also, I would argue, kind of philosophers of mind and theologians would be very important. Actually, we at Stanford, at our center, we had our first conference, and it was on the center being compassion and altruism. Our first conference was really on the issues of definition, because people are using terms like compassion, altruism, left and right, with all sorts of different interpretations. So we had a conference, and there in one of my early presentations, I really made an appeal to the scientific community that, sometimes, scientists tends to kind of dominate the discourse, whatever field that they, jump into. And they sort of, often, so for example, in the case of, say, studying compassion, altruism, and so on, now this is a territory where the slate is not clean. This is a territory where philosophy and religion has been there for thousands of years, and you cannot act as if this human wisdom and insight that has been accumulated over a period of thousands of years that somehow doesn't count for anything. And also, in the end, when neuroscientists interpret patterns that you see as a result of scanning, what you see is just patterns, and someone has to interpret it. When you interpret it, you have to use language, which by borrowing words like compassion, altruism, empathy, and so on, which already has meaning within the wider context of its usage. So already you are bringing in terms which has a long history. So therefore, I think it is important that scientists, when they engage particularly in the study of the human mind and emotions, and particularly qualities like compassion and altruism, which are so dear to our self-identity as moral agents, moral beings, I think there is a kind of kind of ethical responsibility to at least acknowledge the insights that has been developed in the past, and also what it could mean for the future as well.
That sounds wonderful, and I could find it hard to disagree with. You did say in your words here that something about serving humanity, and there is this little problem that the Catholic scholars call the problem of evil. It keeps cropping up, and it's something that anybody serving humanity would try to overcome. I'm tempted at this point, as we throw this open to a discussion amongst you all, if any of the three of you have any questions here. I saw you, Paul, I detected. Well,
I will be very happy to comment about the problem of evil, because I have written a book that Darwin's Gift to Science and Religion. Darwin's theory of evolution is a great gift to science. It completed the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries that had left out the diversity and adaptations of organisms because they seemed to be the result of design. Now, Darwin was able to explain, and of course the theory has developed much since, he was able to explain that design can come about by natural processes that our eyes designed to see, but is the result of a natural process, the evolutionary process, and so on with the rest of the parts of the organism. What Darwin did thereby is to contribute at least the principle of solution to the problem of evil. How do you explain the cruelty that exists in the world of life? There are imperfections, there are dysfunctions, there is cruelty, there is sadism in the world of life. Before the theory of evolution, it was very difficult to account for that. I mean, the creation of parasites, whose only way of life is by killing the host, and the cruelty of lions devouring their prey, now which is the result of natural processes. So in that sense, I think evolution is much more compatible with Christian faith, with religion in general, I would say.
Because it tells us what original sin is?
No, it's because the evolution does not tell what original sin is. What evolution tells us is that the cruelty of life, the sadism of life, that the reason why there are 20 million spontaneous abortions in the world is not because God designed the human reproductive system badly, which is the implication of creationism and intelligent design. The 20% of all human pregnancies end in spontaneous abortion during the first 2 months of pregnancy. If that is because our reproductive system is very badly designed. If that reproductive system was designed by God, as the proponents of intelligent design creationism argue, then they have to explain, they are making God responsible for 20 million abortions per year. Now, evolution says, no, this is the human reproductive system came about as the result of natural processes. In the same way that we have earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanic eruptions as the result of natural processes, that we don't have to attribute them to a specific action of God.
But didn't God, the question comes up at this point, didn't God design those natural processes? Elaine, were you?
No, this is on a different issue.
Yeah, this is a somewhat different issue because, of course, people say at the end of it, God is accountable. Let me then tell you how I approach the question. Let us think of human beings, okay? We have free will. As a consequence of free will, we commit crimes and we do awful deeds. Now, God could have created robots rather than human beings. No free will, there will be no sin, no evil. But I could not think that robots are a good substitute for human beings. God could have created a world where there was no evolution, where there were no cruelty or sadism, or for that matter, spontaneous abortions, but they would not account for the tremendous diversity of the living world, the millions and millions of species that come with the beauty of that we biologists can appreciate. God also could have created a world in which the galaxies were not expanding and the continents were not moving. But that would be much less interesting world than the one we have. The consequence of the world we have is that we have earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, and we have these problems with the living world and with the human freedom. But this is the world in which we live, which is a beautiful world and full of creativity.
Elaine?
Well, you know, in your last exchange, I realized the problem I had with your question about belief. I came to the view that belief is overrated in Christianity because we had this movement for over 300 years before it was formulated as a set of propositions. It's a matter of shared values. It's a matter of compassion. There's a great deal in religion with it, except in the sense that Paul spoke about belief in a kind of deep structure of order. It reminded me of Freeman Dyson's writing, I'm a practicing Christian, but not a believing Christian. And to me, that makes some sense.
Explain that a little bit further.
Well, I can practice by going to the local Episcopal church where I live, which I often do, or to yoga, or meditating, or walking in the mountains. There are many ways to practice a sense of spiritual reality, whether in community or in solitude.
Without believing?
There may be beliefs, but I could not articulate them very well. Why don't you help me out with this?
I mean, psychologists might need to help us out at this point because they would tell us, perhaps some of them, that belief helps us keep our act together. It helps us stay cogent.
It depends what you mean by belief, yes.
Paul, you're
no, because you have to understand, you're using this word religion, you know, in this very superficial way. Religion means a religious organization. It means a tradition, a certain way of thinking about the world, belonging to something. Martin Rees, Lord Rees, the president of the Royal Society, is in the same category as Freeman Dyson, in the sense that he goes to church services, he likes the tradition, he says he wants to be, in an interview, wants to be buried with full Christian tradition, but he's an atheist. So religion amounts to much more than the theology that underpins it.
And indeed, as we were saying before, absolute truth, scientists often say, doesn't belong to science either. And there have been surveys, we should mention, recently one of about 2,000 scientists, and found that about 50% of them describe themselves as being religious. It didn't go into greater details about their belief systems.
It might just mean that they enjoy going to church or going to the synagogue or partaking. I mean, I have a colleague, and she's an Orthodox Jewess, and she's a scientist, a very brilliant scientist, and on a Friday afternoon, you know, there's all these problems about how we're going to communicate over the weekend and so on, and she's very, very strict, and I say to her, well, what's all this about? You know, you think the devil's going to get you or something if you switch on a light on a Saturday? What? Explain this to me. And she said, well, it's all about discipline and cultural identity and tradition, and it's very, for me, it's an elevating practice to take this one day out for me in a very special way, and doesn't have to be underpinned by any theology. It's part of a cultural tradition.
Jinpa, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was going to pick up on one, Elaine, and your discussion about belief. You know, one of the things that I noticed when I, went to Cambridge as a student in the late 80s, I noticed that, because I was at King's, and King's College has this beautiful chapel, and I used to often go to the beautiful evening songs. And I also had friends in the divinity faculty, and I noticed, fairly soon that there was this real tension in the idea of belief And belief was almost always kind of exclusively understood in terms of propositional belief. I believe that. So there's a kind of a factual characterization of the content of the belief. And if you say, I believe in this, you're basically subscribing to the proposition, I believe that this is true. Whereas, I came from a tradition where we have a term that is the closest approximation to the term belief or faith, which is Shraddha or Deva in Tibetan, Shraddha in Sanskrit. And this is a term that has a much more emotional quality as well. So, for example, it has a connotation of trust. So, for example, someone can have this kind of faith in one's spiritual teacher. Someone can have that kind of trust in a particular tradition. So that does not mean, so this is a understanding of faith or belief in a non-propositional sense. It's a way of being.
Are you suggesting that if somebody says, I believe that this or that is true, that's very basically the same thing that scientists say, I believe that the earth is round?
Exactly. So that's a propositional belief, where you are subscribing to the factual truth of the content of that belief.
So
whereas in a religious context, belief and faith should have, at least that's the way I understand, much more richer connotation, so that it's not reduced simply to a factual proposition.
It does in Hebrew as well. Excuse me for interrupting.
Sure. Go ahead and say yes.
Well, in Hebrew as well, and maybe someone can help me out with this because I'm not an expert in it, but the word emet is about trust.
I believe in Hebrew is about trust.
In the Lord, but that's a different.
Yeah. But so when you say trust, it's a completely different meaning if you say I believe that.
Well, to talk to the scientists at the other end of the line here, that would sound like it's similar to what scientists say when they say, I believe that this is the case. I have trust at the moment in this hypothesis until someone can show us a better one. Are we on the right track here?
Well, you are in the right track, but there's a big difference between the way science operates and the way in which art or other forms of knowledge of human experience operate, including religion. In the case of science, because we are dealing with our experience of the material universe, we can have hypotheses or theories that now we can subject to observation and experiment and corroborate them or reject them. And then we gain more and more confidence that they are correct as we keep corroborating them or we reject others. There is always the possibility in science, no matter how much evidence you have accumulated in favor of the theory, there is another theory that accounts for all the observations you have made and much more. And theory of relativity compared with Newtonian mechanics is a clear example. Everybody thought Newtonian mechanics was very well established. This is Paul's field. But suddenly Einstein was able to explain by negating some of the basic assumptions of Newtonian mechanics, was able to explain the same things that Newtonian mechanics could explain and more.
So this very important point, you're saying that there's always the possibility in science that there's an even better, more complete theory out there. So there's always a point, some people would put it this way, there's always a point within science where, what do you say there, where God begins, where the possibility of something greater begins? Is that what God is, the point at which our theories have reached their limits? Is that the way you think about it, Paul?
Not really, no. I mean, I'd like to pick up on this point because science is really about reliable knowledge. It's
reliable knowledge.
Yes, and it's always tentative. It's always provisional. Nobody's ever said the last word, and Dirac's equation, is not necessarily the last word on the behavior of relativistic electrons. We're always open to the fact that we can have a better theory. Theories are not right or wrong. They're just better and better approximations of the world.
And then what is religion about?
Religion, well, you see, you keep coming back to this word religion.
Yes.
Well, faith, religion, all these are terrible words.
No.
So what interests me is there any meaning underpinning this wonderful universe we live in? We have all these equations, all these this majesty of the cosmos. It's so awe-inspiring. The question is it just a meaningless accident? It's just something that happens to be, and we can't deduce anything deeper about it? Or through doing science, are we uncovering some deeper scheme of things? Is there something behind it?
And so far you're coming up with?
Well, I've always felt that there is. I think you can't be a scientist without, as a matter of trust, I guess is the best word, supposing that there is an intelligible order in nature, and that as we dig deeper and deeper, we will continue to find more intelligible order and not just meaningless mumbo-jumbo. And that the world is put together in this incredibly ingenious, incredibly beautiful, in mathematical manner, incredibly mathematical manner. And so you want to go beyond that and say, is there a super being who made it all? Is there a mind, a cosmic magician who conjured it into existence? I hate all that sort of language because I think it's going back to a pre-scientific age and it's casting the question in the wrong term.
You're happy to stay in a state of wonder there.
We've got to go beyond it. Well, no, I don't think we just say, well, you know, it's all just amazing and we give up at this point. I just think we need a new vocabulary, a new way forward. We need to, if I can just use up a little bit more of your time, I feel that the United States may be the exception. In most of the Western world, it's a post-religious society. People have lost their spiritual moorings, if you like, and they're casting around to position themselves into a universe that's wonderful, it's awe-inspiring, but it's also frightening. And they're looking for an anchor. They're looking for a way of understanding how they fit into this grand cosmic scheme of things. And I see the march of science, and I see my role as catering to these people who've sort of lost their way and want to see how they fit in to the cosmic scheme of things in this post-religious age.
In the post-religious, we're building a big story for the whole planet, the whole species.
And yes, and for ourselves, and if there are any other intelligent beings out there in the universe, which is a whole different story.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe the same one, yes?
And that's a wonderful work to have. And mine is also about finding that religion and religious traditions all over the world are not just a meaningless mumbo-jumbo either. That I think of what the poet Marianne Moore said about poetry. She said, poetry is imaginary gardens with real toads in them. So your question about is, do you believe in it? Well, I say you don't have to take it literally, but in the imaginary gardens that are our religious traditions, there are realities that we encounter.
Religions, in other words, are ways of talking about and conveying important meaning?
For example, I mean, you've never seen a Leviathan monster, right? In nature, they don't occur, but they do occur in dreams. They do occur in stories and legends. They're all over the creation stories of Babylonia and Egypt and Israel. Those happen to be ones more familiar to me. They're part of the way we envision the world. And there are realities in those. There are real toads in this imaginary garden.
Are you very hopeful about humanity's impulses as you've seen and studied them down through the years, in particularly with Christianity? Do you feel that you detect something ultimately good in where we're going?
Well, I think what I study in religion is all about moving us toward hope.
Toward hope.
Hope, absolutely. That's a great part of it. So I guess that intrigues me a great deal. Yes.
Towards hope.
Yes.
Why?
Because we need it.
Why do we need it?
That's how we live. I don't.
That's how we live.
I don't understand the question.
That gets around to that's how we live. That gets around to questions of survival.
Yes,
that's how we survive. That's how we keep going. And it says in the book of Genesis, and God saw that it was good, that we should go on, that we should want to survive. But mere survival alone is sometimes taught by religions or faith systems or moral or ethical systems as not being the only ultimate good when there's altruism, for example. As Edward Wilson, as you were talking about, talks about the fact that altruism within groups sometimes means the self-sacrifice of some individuals.
Sure.
Jinpa, you're nodding about this.
Well, I mean, every time I hear the kind of the certain attempts on the part of scientists to explain religion, I have a feeling that in the end, the attempt is to explain religion away by invoking some kind of function, like Darwinian evolutionary theory-based functions.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, I mean, my own view is that science and whatever we may want to call it, spirituality, faith, religion, whatever we may want to call it, I think each has its own place. And at least this is for me. I see kind of the worldview as being the big kind of container, in the German sense, Weltanschauung, and scientific perspective being an important component of it. That's the window through which you understand the physical reality that we live, we embody. But spirituality, faith, and religion also is another dimension, aspect of that worldview. And my own view is that somehow, in order to have an integrated worldview, we would need both. Mm-hmm. Because in the end, if the worldview is just science, then there is no place for meaning and purpose. Because science is, at least as I understand, it's a system of inquiry and collective knowledge, gathered through that system, where repeatability, quantification, certain empirical method is an integral part of that gathering of the knowledge. But if one were to argue that the scientific worldview consists the entirety of the knowledge of human existence, then that means whatever facts there are somehow must fit within that scope of the scientific inquiry and mode of inquiry.
And you're saying that what we need is meaning and purpose.
Right. Well, meaning, purpose, there's a whole, I mean, for example, you began your opening remarks with the question, why is there something other than nothing? How can science even begin to imagine grappling with that question? It's completely outside the domain of
Actually, I didn't put it that way. I said how amazing it is that anything exists at all. I wasn't asking why is there. That's more a scientific question. I was just expressing amazement.
Yeah, but I mean, even why wouldn't be a scientific question. I mean, would you say it's a scientific question?
No, it's not a scientific
It's not a scientific question?
Why is there something rather than nothing? It's not a scientific question. Science deals with the world.
Exactly.
Okay, so it takes the world as given and then it tries to make sense of it.
With connecting with this discussion now, I would reiterate my initial point that if you take the Guernica, you can give a complete physical description of the Guernica, going down to all the coordinates of all the brush strokes and everything else, and say that's what the Guernica is, and says, no, you have not started to tell me all the things that I want to know about the Guernica. What is the meaning? This message of the inhumanity of humans to humans, the horror of war. So once science has had its say, and I believe, as Paul does, and every scientist believes, I mean, it's a way of speaking, believing, but that science has a lot to say, and something which is very rewarding and satisfying and gives a lot of understanding of the world. But once science has had its say, there is a lot to be said about the world which transcends science. The meaning and purpose of life, values, moral values, aesthetic values, all sorts of other dimensions of reality which transcend science. So important as science is, it has given us technology, and much of the modern economy depends on science and technology. But there's much more to life than the economy.
So to be precise here, before we open that up for questions, you're saying that science does not have to speak to moral values or ethical values? Science cannot talk about that?
By itself, it cannot. That transcends the methods of science, which deals with physical reality and with the ways in which we can explore physical reality by observation and experiment.
Let me ask each of the panelists this question before we open. Paul, do you think that science can or cannot speak to questions of moral and ethical values?
Well, I think it can in one obvious sense, which is that we can try to understand the evolution of altruism. Francisco was talking earlier about evil, the problem of evil, and how do we understand this in a Darwinian context. That's easy. It's understanding good that is actually the challenge. Why do organisms behave altruistically? Now, we might think we're pretty altruistic, but we've got nothing on the ants, some of whom, the worker ants will work for their entire lives all for the sake of the queen and sacrifice themselves totally. They don't reproduce. But there's good genetic explanation for that. So I think that there is a basis for understanding altruism in nature, so to that extent. But when we get into the sort of higher realm of human ethical behavior, I don't think at the moment science has made much headway. I think it's possible that through the cognitive sciences, better understanding of evolutionary psychology and so on, we might make more progress. But if, as I suggested earlier, I don't necessarily believe it, but some people maintain that there are emergent laws, then there could be laws of ethics which emerge at a sufficient level of complexity with certain thresholds. And if there are such laws, then they should be amenable ultimately to scientific investigation.
And a quick question of definition. By evil, do you mean something that causes suffering? Or do you have a definition of evil?
Right, well, you were talking with Francisco earlier about Guernica, for example. So from that point of view, evil is, you know, when people do bad things to each other, and how
To each other.
Yeah, and how can we understand that? And suffering, how can we understand that in an evolutionary context? I think we can. I think that understanding that is much easier than understanding good.
Elaine, do you think science can speak to and help us understand moral reasoning and ethics and moral values?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question. I'd have to think about it more.
Because you're not a scientist, you're a
That's
scholar.
right,
You're
that's right.
Does it work the other way around? Do you find places in the history of the scholarship that you've done in the history of Christianity in which you find religion wanting to go and look to science for finding meaning or not?
Again, I mean, I have more the sense of complementary and quite distinct ways of perceiving.
That there are two different systems of perceiving.
Yes, they are. And each of them is not a single system.
But not mutually exclusive? They can live in the same...
certainly not.
Yeah, right.
Obviously not.
Jinpa, how do
Necessarily.
you feel that science can help illuminate the existence of moral values and ethics? Or is this a question that a Buddhist... Well, how do you...
I know that there is now a movement among scientists to try to naturalize ethics. That's how I would see it, because increasingly many of the kind of characteristics that are essential part of an ethical system, like sense of fairness and altruism, and these are, empathy. At least some of these are being, observed in non-human primates. And if that is the case, although there is some dispute, or if that is the case, then the argument goes that there must be an evolutionary, naturalistic explanation for the emergence of these qualities, and therefore the values that are based on these qualities could be explained in some point in the future. And it looks like quite a promising, enterprise. But in the end, I would argue, when it comes to bringing in moral evaluation of what is right and what is wrong, that evaluation value has to be brought in from somewhere else.
Other than science?
Other than science.
Of what is... So sense of right and wrong comes from somewhere other than science?
I think it has to be, come from somewhere else. It has to be somehow perhaps connected with, experience of pain and pleasure, suffering, and so on. But it has to be, the idea has to be invoked from some other source other than science. That's my own belief.
And what might that other source be?
Moral intuitions, shared moral intuitions.
Moral intuitions.
Yeah.
Moral
Or it could be spiritual intuitions, whatever we may want to call it.
I would like to emphasize that point because we have been mentioned biological altruism. Biological altruism is completely different from moral altruism. Biological altruism, the altruism of A.O. Wilson, is based purely in the calculus of the genes. Genes behave in such ways that help other individuals because they carry the same genes. It's just purely a biological process. Moral altruism is when we do something by taking into account the interests of others. It's a completely different level of consideration, morality and biology. And again, it's very dangerous in this case, the use of the word with such two different meanings. I mean, I could elaborate the calculus that Ed Wilson and many others have done to explain what they call biological altruism. That has nothing to do
with moral altruism.
Moral altruism.
Well, we'll check that out with him. Maybe next year we'll have Ed Wilson here explaining the difference between moral altruism and biological altruism.
He's my very dear friend, and we have talked about these things many times.
Indeed. So now let's open it up to a few questions. We have a few more minutes, and please, I would ask to make sure that these are questions, not statements of great length or sermons, but questions to any or all of our panelists here. Hang on a second, I've got to stand up so that I can see because of the lights. Yes, there's a man standing there. We have a microphone here. Can we get it to this gentleman? All right.
I was wondering if Ms. Pagels and Mr. Davies can find common ground in the primordial superstring that functions as your super turtle and the harmonics of the Pythagorean tradition that's in the roots of Gnosticism.
Could you repeat that question once more?
No, I think we understand it perfectly.
There will be an hour exam tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Just repeat it once more. Go slowly. It sounds like a lot of fun.
I was wondering if Miss Pagels and Mr. Davies can find common ground in the primordial superstring that functions as your super turtle. I believe, maybe Mr. Brian Greene has there's a religious war about superstring theory. I don't know where Mr. Davies stands on it.
Right.
But between the harmonics of the primordial superstring and the roots of Gnosticism, which I believe are in the Pythagorean tradition of harmonics.
Go for it. Great question.
I'll have to deal with this tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
There are a lot of things buried in there, and we don't have time to discuss them all,
Yeah,
except to just
very interesting,
make the
but-
point that the notion that the universe is ordered in a mathematical manner is a very ancient one, and certainly goes back to the Pythagorean tradition.
Yes.
That, in particular, saw the power of musical harmony and geometrical configuration as underpinning the universe. And today we've built on those ideas, and as I said earlier, the Dirac equation is one example of the mathematical hidden subtext of nature. So whether that's a Gnostic approach, I mean, in some ways, we're sort of communing. I don't know, where do we get these mathematical ideas from? Mathematical inspiration and Gnosticism may not be too different from each other.
Actually, that is a really provocative kind of question. I mean, I was thinking in Jewish mystical thought, there's gematria, which is a numerical system which speaks about meaning in very different kinds of formula. And I remember asking my late husband once when we were driving through the mountains whether he ever looked at the world as if it were in mathematical or musical harmony. And he looked surprised and said, well, of course, that's what physics is all about.
Right.
Harmony is pleasing to us humans. Makes you feel good.
Yeah, the physics does make you feel good. I can recommend it.
For those who are lucky enough to be healthy and secure enough to enjoy it, it certainly is. Another question. I see a hand up there. Yes, ma'am. We'll bring a microphone to you.
I guess listening to everyone in the front, it seems to me that the real question is not between, or the real conflict is not between faith and science. But wouldn't you say that the conflict is between the certainty of either faith or science versus the trust or faith that both types of thinking can create?
Interesting question. He's saying that that the real conflict is between certainty and trust. To pick up on your position there, yes?
I will deny the assumption. I don't think there is a conflict. I think there is no necessary conflict between religion and science, or between faith and science. The conflict arises when either one of the two fields transgresses its proper boundaries, when people use, for example, the narrative of Genesis that from the beginning of Christianity said should not be understood as an elementary book of astronomy or of physics. They understand the narrative of Genesis as if it were science. That's when we have contradiction between science and faith, or when people, scientists, use science or scientific knowledge to deny the existence of God or religious values. I, for one, don't believe there is conflict. I think the two words, as it has been said repeatedly, and I think all of us have been saying this in different ways. I think the two worlds are compatible, and I would say in many ways they are not only compatible, they can be supporting each other.
Supporting each other. If I understood your question, so you were saying that in other words, you're agreeing with what he's saying and saying that the conflict would be the conflict between those who want to be really certain and those who want to have instead a kind of a belief. Is that right? Yes. In other words, his concept of belief is something other than certainty, but a kind of a faithful posture. Is that right?
I think it does raise an important issue because often, when you see tensions, in that interaction between religion and science, what is often happening is that you have two very kind of strong positions, each insisting on certainty and also on the assumption of some kind of completeness of knowledge. And so I think, and whether it is on the religious side or whether it is on the non-religious side, that instinct for seeking certainty and the drive towards kind of imposing one's own view as the totality of the view is going to lead to tension. It doesn't really matter whether it is coming from the religious side or whether it is coming from the non-religious side.
It'll lead to tension.
So, for example, on the non-religious side, those who insist that their picture is the only true picture and there cannot be anything else. If you go on this line, then whatever alternative stories there are is going to be in contradiction to your story.
That tension can sometimes be creative if you don't take it too far.
Sure, but the thing is, when you have certainty plus insistence on completeness, that's when the problem starts.
Insistence on completeness.
If it is a certainty, but then if the assumption for totality is not there, comprehensiveness, or then I think there is less room for tension.
And but you're nodding happily about this, as if in other words, it's more complete, more inclusive.
Yes, I was just agreeing with you. I was thinking of one of your colleagues, who I won't name, but a well-known elementary particle physicist who wrote in his book about the beginning of the universe. The more we know about the universe, the more we know it is pointless and meaningless. And it's a complete non sequitur.
Why so?
You explain this. You explain this.
Why is that a non sequitur?
Because physics does not address those kinds of issues in that way.
Yes, of course, it's Steve Weinberg.
Of course it is Steve Weinberg. I know.
He's very.
Don't tell anybody.
He's famous for that.
We all know who
He's
it
very
is.
happy to.
Stephen likes to play the village atheist. Yeah.
But it's a non sequitur because it's apples and oranges in effect? It's not the kind of thing that physics deals with.
I think it's actually back to front, and I've written about this particular point because for me the most extraordinary thing, and I wanted to make this point anyway, about human beings is not that we just observe the universe, so we make sense of it. Through science and mathematics we can come to understand how the universe works. That is an absolutely astonishing thing. People take science for granted because it's all around us and the fruits of science are all around us, but just stop to think about it. This thing in here, which has evolved over millions and millions of years.
As part of the universe.
Right. Not only observes and responds to the world around us, like cats and dogs and birds and all the rest of it, and so some of them respond better than we do. We can make sense of it. We can come to decode nature and understand what's going on. That is an absolutely astonishing thing.
And as some of the medieval scholastics pointed out, we are part of the universe, so it's like the universe wants to understand itself.
Well, through human beings and who knows other beings in the universe has not only become self-aware, but has come to comprehend itself. So we're part of this great drama of nature that involves much more than majesty and big distances and huge masses and explosions and so on. It involves comprehension. And that, I think, is the most significant fact. And that's why I think that the more we come to understand the universe, the more there does seem to be a point to it.
And we're part of it, so it's the universe becoming self-aware, or we're part of it becoming self-aware. there are so many more questions. We have time for just 2 more, and then we'll probably be cut off. I see someone's hand right there. Him and then him. I actually can't see. I just see movement there, but there's a person there with a hat on.
Hello. I was just wondering if you think science will ever get to the point where we can draw kind of a deep faith from it to the point where religion wouldn't be necessary anymore because, like Thupten said, Buddhism doesn't really perceive any God outside of what's going on, or what is. And because science is kind of the study of what is, do you think that eventually science can kind of unify us as opposed to religion, which mostly divides us?
Well, there's lots of premises there.
Right. Well, science does not tell anything about the meaning and purpose of life, and about many other things, about moral values and about our relationships, the values that should govern our relationship with each other. So I don't think science is going to reach ever a point at which religion or morality or other kinds of knowledge will be unnecessary. I can keep describing the Guernica again and again, all the physical details of that painting, and I still will be missing what is most interesting to most people. Science will never fill that role.
And another comment here? I mean,
I'd like to just repeat the point I made earlier because the gentleman used the word religion. Religion is a tremendous variety of things, and science might concern itself with issues where we get into theology, and are there necessary beings? Did the universe have a beginning? And on all of those sorts of rarefied points of discussion. But when it comes to daily life and people who follow a religious tradition, it's an enormous comfort to them. I don't think science provides much comfort at the bedside of a dying person, for example. So religion has these social and psychological and cultural aspects to it as well. And I don't think I can't ever envisage a time when science is too austere will be able to cater for all of those needs. But it may replace old-fashioned theology, but not religion in its broadest sense.
let me just bring up one point. This fellow said at the end, religion which mostly divides us. Other theologians in history of theology and history of religions have pointed out that a number of the great religions have started out by making scientific-like statements of universality. Rabbis Prager and Telushkin have recently written a book called Why the Jews, in which they point out that the Jews bore the burden early on of coming forth and saying to the world, there is a universal moral law. In fact, many of the religions are described by historians of religions each as bringing out different aspects of things that are true for all humans. And so they are like proto-religions that are beginning to support each other in some ways, curiously. Is it possible that in this way, religion and science are similar, if you see where I'm going?
I mean, my own personal view is that, to some extent, as Paul Davies pointed out, that there are certain aspects to old-fashioned theology where there might be claims that are part of a particular religious tradition. The claims may be of empirical nature, which then, as scientific knowledge expands, probably might become more and more obsolete.
Obsolete.
Obsolete. That's a possibility. But in the end, there will always be dimensions of human existence which are not going to be within the scope of scientific knowledge or scientific inquiry. So meaning values and so on. And the fact that why we humans evolved, even from a scientific point of view, we are a very strange species. We are a species that are probably the only ones who wonder about our place in the whole order of universe. I don't think dogs wonder about why they are there.
Do you know that dogs don't?
Well, I mean,
They're not telling us the answer.
so and the whole idea of this kind of, and also one of the things that I really find inspiring from the religious tradition, the religious tradition is very, very old. Old. I mean, thousands and thousands of years ago. And if you look at each of these different religious traditions, in some variations, many of these traditions have certain commonalities, which are expressions of human yearnings to make sense of this really infinity of our existence, and trying to, with this finite human brain, we try to conceive infinity. We try to conceive timelessness, and try to bridge between temporality and infinity, and so I think these are probably very, very deep primordial instincts that we human beings possess, and religious beliefs and religious practices and religious faith, many aspects of them are expressions of that very deep yearning, and I don't ever envision a time where a human society will be there will be no religion.
Right.
I don't envision that possibility.
We have one more question, and then I believe we'll have to cut it off. Yes? If we can get a microphone over there.
Thank you. Thank you for talking. So, questioning authority and questioning paradigm, and then having those hypotheses go through the sieve of natural selection, or a form of a sieve of natural selection, is how the scientific method progresses science and technology forward. What I don't understand is how bowing to traditions that are centuries old, what mechanism does that use, bowing to those kind of traditions to progress things like science does?
Wait, just state that last part again, so we have it very clearly. How does bowing to tradition?
How does bowing to traditions, such like not answering the phone on a Saturday, contribute to the progress of reducing human suffering?
Seeing as I raised the telephone issue, so my friend and colleague, she says, so it's not about advancing science, it's about cultural identity and personal discipline, which may indirectly help her in her science. Maybe Saturdays are great days to reflect on the meaning of her scientific work. I don't know. But I don't think anybody's claiming that you can't do good science without looking back into the past and following a religious tradition. But I do want to make this point, that I like to provoke my colleagues by pointing out that the worldview that physicists adopt and cosmologists adopt in doing their science is the worldview that derives directly from monotheistic theology, because it's the notion of a created law-like order in nature, which you uncover by exploring the world. And the early scientists like Newton and Galileo were deeply religious in their own way, and they thought that they were uncovering God's handiwork in the world, and that the laws of nature are immutable, eternal, universal, absolute mathematical relationships which are transcendent. They're imposed on the world from without, like the Maker's Mark, stamped onto the world, and it's unchanged. That is the worldview that my colleagues adopt. All of my physicist colleagues, that's the way they understand the world is put together. That is manifestly a theistic worldview. And I like to say to them, after 350 years of that worldview, hasn't the time come to question that? Because it quite clearly comes from theological roots. So they are, in that sense, although they've no longer religious, these scientists, they are nevertheless adopting this theistic worldview. We can question it. The world doesn't have to be put together that way. I'm not sure it is.
And to bring up the second part of your question about how does it help prevent human suffering, there's obviously the point that many of the great religions have done and do an enormous amount of great service to lessen suffering. The Buddhists, the Catholics all over the world with orphanages and hospitals, you were going to say?
No, nothing.
Yes, okay.
Well, it cuts both ways.
It cuts both ways.
We've
Indeed. Well,
We could talk about that for a long time.
I'm sure there are many more questions here, and our panelists will be here for a few minutes. This is a wonderful point at which to leave it. I think, and I hope, that we've opened up a great many new questions and ways of talking. So with thanks for this display of how science, faith, religion, whichever words we use, are now talking to each other in whole new ways, let's give a round of applause of thanks to our wonderful panelists.